She held the paper out like it was something official, like it carried the weight of law just because she had printed it on crisp white stock and driven it out herself rather than mailing it. Patricia Coleman stood in the gravel drive of Ethan Walker's 25-acre property on a Tuesday morning in early October. Dressed in a blazer that was 2 sizes too formal for the occasion, her chin lifted just enough to signal that she expected no resistance. The document in her hand declared that a lien had been placed on the property, $5,000 in fines, plus administrative fees, and that Ethan had 30 days to pay the full balance and bring his property into compliance with the Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The violation in question, the paint color on his equipment shed, did not appear on the HOA's approved palette. It was a minor-sounding thing, a technicality about a color that most people would dismiss on sight, but Patricia had learned long ago that minor-sounding things applied with enough institutional weight and enough bureaucratic patience tended to produce compliance faster than outright demands. She had a system. She had refined it over years. She arrived in person dressed authoritatively, spoke with the calm certainty of someone holding the full power of an organization behind her words, delivered the notice, and waited. Most people confronted with that combination asked only one question: where do I send the check? Patricia delivered this information with the calm precision of someone who had done it many times before, because she had. She told him he had 30 days. She told him the association would escalate if necessary. Then she turned and walked back to her white sedan without waiting for a reply. Ethan watched her go. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave the paper back in her direction or call after her. He simply stood there in the cool morning air, holding the document, reading it a second time, and then a third, because the mind tends to search for a logic that isn't there when something is fundamentally obviously wrong. His property was not part of Silver Creek Estates. It never had been. He had owned this land for over 2 decades, long before the development was carved out of the hills to his east, long before the manicured lawns and stone-fronted townhomes and community amenity center existed at all. His fence line was his fence line. His deed was his deed. And yet here was a lien filed by a private homeowners association against a piece of land that did not belong to it, demanding payment for a shed painted a color that no one had ever asked him about. Ethan Walker was 61 years old. He had spent the better part of his career as a civil infrastructure engineer, the kind of man who understood load-bearing calculations and water table maps and the language buried inside survey reports. He had worked on municipal projects, county drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure that most people never think about until it stops working. He had retired early, not from exhaustion, but from intention. He had always wanted land of his own, something to work with his hands, something quieter than project timelines and contractor disputes. He found the property in the hills of western Tennessee before the developers found the same hills, bought it outright, and spent the years since building something that suited him. A main cabin, a workshop, an equipment shed painted the particular shade of dark green he liked because it reminded him of the tree line in November. He grew vegetables. He kept 2 horses. He did not bother anyone. He went inside and poured himself a cup of coffee and read the lien document one more time slowly, the way he had been trained to read technical contracts, looking not for what it said, but for what it assumed. And what it assumed was that he was a resident of Silver Creek Estates, that he had signed governing documents, that he was subject to the same covenants and restrictions as the 800 or so families who had purchased homes inside that development. None of that was true, but a lien once filed with the county recorder does not disappear on its own. It sits in the title record like a splinter, and it makes itself known every time anyone tries to refinance, sell, or transfer the property. That was the mechanism Patricia was using. It didn't matter whether the lien was legitimate. What mattered was that it was there, and that clearing it required time and money and attention resources that most people would rather spend avoiding conflict than pursuing it. That was the calculation. Ethan understood it immediately. This was not a dispute about paint. This was an attempt to create enough legal friction that he would simply pay to make it go away. He finished his coffee and picked up his phone. The first call he made was to his daughter, Emma. She was in her 2nd year of law school in Nashville, and she had inherited her father's habit of reading things carefully, and her mother's habit of stating the conclusion before explaining the reasoning. When Ethan described the situation, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "The lien itself is almost certainly unenforceable, but that's not the point. The point is, it's in the county record." She walked him through it methodically. A homeowners association can only place a lien against properties that are subject to its governing documents. If Ethan's land was never part of the development, never included in the recorded plat, never the subject of any covenant agreement he signed, then the HOA had no legal standing to assess fines against him, let alone file a lien. Filing a lien under those circumstances wasn't just overreach, it was potentially a tortious act. It could constitute slander of title, which is a cause of action that allows a property owner to sue when someone knowingly files a false or invalid encumbrance against their land. Emma told him not to respond emotionally and not to ignore it. Document everything she said. Get a real estate attorney. After he hung up, Ethan went to the storage room off the main hallway and brought out the fireproof metal cabinet he kept his most important documents in. He had always been meticulous about paper and occupational habit. He kept originals and copies organized by category in labeled folders. He found his property deed without much searching. He laid it on the kitchen table and read it with the same attention he had given the lien. He had read this deed before, of course, many times, but he had not in recent years read the full text of the appurtenant rights section. Most deeds in rural Tennessee contain language about water rights that is boilerplate references to creeks or springs that cross the property standard riparian provisions. What Ethan found when he read this section carefully was not boilerplate. The deed included a recorded easement and prior appropriation right granted in perpetuity with priority status in the county water registry to the freshwater lake located at the northeastern boundary of the property. The lake was named. It was called Silver Lake. The right included the use diversion and control of water from the lake and its associated aquifer for agricultural, residential, and commercial purposes with priority over any subsequent claims filed after the date of Ethan's original purchase. The right had been recorded separately with the County Water Authority at the time of purchase, something the previous owner had insisted on, and Ethan had agreed to without much thought because at the time, it had seemed like reasonable due diligence for a rural property. He put the deed down and picked up the survey maps he kept in the folder behind it. He unfolded the largest one on the kitchen table and weighted the corners with a coffee mug, his keys, and a small river stone he used as a paperweight. He found Silver Lake on the map. He found his property boundary. And then he found, because he was an infrastructure engineer, and he knew how to read this kind of map, the inlet and outlet markers that indicated how the lake fed into the surrounding water system. He traced the outlet line with his finger. It ran northeast through a section of undeveloped land that had since been absorbed into the Silver Creek Estates development. The same development whose HOA had just put a lien on his shed. He sat with that for a moment. Then he called Robert Hayes. Robert Hayes had been Ethan's closest friend since they served together in the Army in their early 20s, assigned to the same engineering unit for 3 years, and separated afterward by geography, but never really by distance in the way that matters. Robert had gone to law school on the GI Bill and built a practice in real estate and property law that had grown over 30 years into one of the more respected firms in the state. He had the kind of professional reputation that is built not on courtroom theatrics, but on the steady accumulation of cases won and clients protected on being the person in the room who had read every document before anyone else arrived. He was the kind of lawyer who read documents the way surgeons read imaging, looking for what was there, what wasn't there, and what someone had hoped you wouldn't notice. When Ethan explained the situation, Robert didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he asked Ethan to photograph the deed and the survey maps and send them to him right away. He called back 2 hours later. His voice had a particular quality that Ethan had learned over decades to recognize the controlled steadiness of someone who has found something significant and is making sure not to get ahead of it. Robert told him the lien was a serious legal error on Patricia's part. The association had no colorable claim against a non-member property, but he also told him that the water rights section of the deed was extraordinary and that before he did anything else, he needed to pull the original water registry filing from the county and confirm that the priority date was what it appeared to be. He would handle that. In the meantime, Robert's advice was simple. Say, nothing, publicly document every contact from the HOA and do not pay a single dollar. Within 4 days, Robert had the county records. The priority appropriation right was filed in Ethan's name, uncontested, with a date that predated the Silver Creek Estates development permit by more than 4 years. He had also obtained a copy of the original municipal water survey for the development the engineering report prepared at the time the project was permitted. What that report showed was that the development's entire water infrastructure had been designed around the Silver Lake source. The community's water treatment facility drew from the lake via a subsurface intake. The storage reservoir was fed from the same aquifer. The distribution lines that served every home, every lawn irrigation system, every pool and fountain in Silver Creek Estates, all of it traced back to the same body of water that Ethan Walker held the prior appropriation rights to. Robert told Ethan on the phone, his voice carrying that same measured quality. Someone made a very large assumption when they permitted this development, and they never bothered to make it a legal certainty. The development had been permitted on the assumption, apparently never formalized, that the water rights would be acquired from the Walker property at some point. They never were. Robert drafted a formal letter to the HOA on firm letterhead. The letter made 3 demands: that the lien be released within 15 days, that all communications with Ethan Walker cease immediately, and that the association's board provide written acknowledgement that his property was not subject to their governing documents. The letter also included, as an attachment, a single paragraph notifying the board that the firm had become aware of certain matters regarding the water rights pertaining to Silver Lake, and that those matters would be addressed through a separate process if the initial demands were not met. It did not threaten. It did not explain. It simply noted the existence of the issue and left the implication to do its work. The HOA did not comply. Instead, within 10 days, Ethan received 3 additional violation notices in the mail. One assessed a fine for his gravel access road, which the association claimed extended too close to the easement boundary. A second cited the equipment shed for a structural issue that was listed in no code he could identify. A third assessed a fine for the appearance of his vegetable garden, which the notice described as inconsistent with community standards. The total penalties now exceeded $10,000. Robert told Ethan it was time to learn more about what Patricia had been doing to other people. Not because it was legally necessary, the water rights case was strong enough on its own, but because the picture mattered. Courts respond to patterns, and juries, if it ever came to that, respond to human stories. Robert said, "I need you to understand the full scope of what she's been doing. Because when we're in that room and we make our case, I want you to know exactly what you're standing up against and exactly who you're standing up for." Ethan drove into the Silver Creek Estates community on a Saturday afternoon and spent several hours knocking on doors. He found Margaret Wilson at the end of a cul-de-sac, a 73-year-old woman who had lived in her townhome for 11 years and had until 18 months ago maintained a small cutting garden along her front walk. Roses, dahlias, lavender, the kind of careful tended planting that takes years to establish. Patricia Coleman had sent her 11 notices over the course of 2 seasons, citing the garden as a landscaping violation. When Margaret had appeared before the board to appeal, the meeting had been scheduled with 3 days' notice at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday when Margaret had standing physical therapy appointments. She had asked for a reschedule. The request was denied. The fines accumulated. Eventually, a contractor hired by the HOA had arrived at her property and removed the plants while she was away, billing the removal cost to her account. Margaret showed Ethan the invoices, the notices, and a series of unanswered letters she had written to the board. Her hands were steady as she held the papers out to him, but her voice was not. She had lived quietly and carefully and done nothing wrong. The garden had been her way of making a home out of a townhouse. They had taken that from her without a second thought. He found Daniel Brooks 2 streets over, a veteran in his mid-50s who used a wheelchair after an injury sustained on his second deployment. Daniel had installed a short ramp alongside his front steps poured in concrete, functionally identical to what the Americans with Disabilities Act required property managers to provide. The HOA had fined him for the ramp on the grounds that it altered the facade of the unit without board approval. When Daniel's wife had pointed out that the modification was medically necessary and legally protected, the board had responded by saying that HOA covenants were private contracts and did not require ADA compliance. The fine remained on his account. The ramp remained because there was no practical alternative, but the notice of violation remained as well, and the pending fine had created a cloud on his title that he could not resolve without legal help he hadn't yet been able to afford. There was a young family on the north side of the development, the Harpers' parents in their 30s with two small children, who had been fined for leaving a tricycle and a small basketball hoop on their back patio. A retired schoolteacher named Frances Albright had received 7 notices over 2 years for the color of her window boxes. A man named Gary Hooper had been assessed a fine for parking his own vehicle in his own driveway at an angle the board deemed non-compliant with community standards. Each person had a folder. Each person had tried in good faith to communicate with the board. Each person had been met with form letters and escalating penalties and the specific variety of bureaucratic contempt that comes from an authority that believes it cannot be challenged. Ethan collected their stories, their documents, their phone numbers. He drove home and sat at his kitchen table for a long time. He had spent his career building infrastructure things meant to hold up, to serve communities, to be reliable and equitable in their function. What Patricia Coleman had built was the opposite, a system designed to concentrate power by making the exercise of it unpredictable and punishing so that the only rational strategy was submission. He had not come to this fight looking for anything beyond the removal of a fraudulent lien. But he understood now that the fight was larger than that, and he had something that most of these people didn't have. He had the leverage. Robert filed the formal water rights notice on a Thursday morning. The document was addressed to the Silver Creek Estates HOA board, copied to the County Water Authority, the County Attorney's Office, and the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. It stated plainly and without embellishment that Ethan Walker held prior appropriation rights to Silver Lake with a priority date and registration that predated all subsequent water claims in the county. It further stated that those rights had never been formally waived, sold, transferred, or subordinated to any subsequent user, including the developer of Silver Creek Estates or the HOA that had assumed governance of that development. The notice gave the board 30 days to initiate good faith negotiations regarding a formal water use agreement failing, which Ethan would exercise his legal right to restrict access to the water source under the terms of his prior appropriation. The letter was precise. It was not aggressive. It stated facts and a timeline and a consequence, and it left the rest to the reader. Robert had drafted it in a single sitting, he told Ethan afterward, because sometimes the clearest letters are the ones that write themselves when the facts are that clean. Patricia Coleman called the next morning. Ethan let Robert handle the call. Robert later described it as a conversation in which Patricia moved through several emotional registers in rapid succession, initially dismissive, then commanding, then confused, then loud. She told Robert that his client was extorting the community. Robert told her calmly that Ethan was exercising a property right that had been legally registered for over 2 decades, and that if the association wished to dispute the validity of that right, they were welcome to do so in county court. He reminded her that the court filings would be public record. He wished her a pleasant morning and ended the call. Within days, Patricia had organized an emergency community meeting. Ethan heard about it through Margaret, who had been given a written notice slid under her door the evening before. The meeting was framed in the notice as an urgent community briefing regarding a threat to the development's water supply posed by an outside actor. There was no mention of the fraudulent lien. There was no mention of the fines levied against residents over the years. The framing was clean and simple. The community was under attack by a hostile neighbor, and the board needed the community's support to fight back. Margaret called Ethan and read him the notice over the phone. He listened without interrupting. Then he told her he was going to attend. The meeting was held at the Silver Creek Estates Community Center on a Wednesday evening. The parking lot was full by 7 o'clock. Ethan arrived at 6:45 and found a seat near the back. He had brought a manila folder. He wore the same thing he wore most days: work trousers, a collared shirt, boots. He did not introduce himself to anyone. He sat quietly while the room filled around him and watched Patricia set up at the front with 2 members of the board and a woman he did not recognize, who turned out to be a local attorney the HOA had retained on an emergency basis. He counted maybe 240 people in the room, a significant fraction of the development's households gathered on short notice. That alone told him something. People had come because they were worried, and worried people were people who were paying attention in a way they had not been before. Patricia opened the meeting with a speech that was in its way an impressive piece of construction. She began with shared values, the investment everyone had made in their homes, the pride they took in the community, the importance of protecting what they had built together. She moved from there To the threat, a neighbor, she said, who had never been part of this community, who had never contributed to its maintenance or its standards, was now claiming that he owned the water and that he had the right to cut it off whenever he chose. She used the word hostage. She used it more than once. She did not use Ethan's name, but she described his property and his profession in enough detail that anyone who knew him would have recognized him immediately. She spoke about the importance of unity. She encouraged residents to stand with the board against what she called an act of aggression by someone who wanted to profit off their fear. She was good at it. Ethan could see the room responding, the tightened postures, the folded arms, the murmured agreement. He had seen that kind of rhetoric work before. It worked best in rooms where people had no alternate information source, where the speaker had shaped the narrative completely before anyone else had a chance to offer a different version of events. That was the vulnerability in Patricia's approach. She had organized the meeting on the assumption that she would control it from start to finish. That assumption was about to fail. When she invited questions, Ethan stood up. He did not rush. He walked to the front of the room slowly, the way a man walks when he is not trying to perform authority, but simply has it. He put his folder on the table in front of him. He looked at Patricia and then at the room. He said his name. He said he lived west of the development on land he had owned since before Silver Creek Estates was built. He said he had not wanted to be here in this room defending himself and that he had tried to resolve this quietly before it became a public matter. He opened the folder. He held up the original lien notice Patricia had delivered to his property. He read the violation aloud, the paint color of the equipment shed. He explained without drama that his property had never been part of Silver Creek Estates, that he had never signed any governing documents, that the HOA had no legal authority over his land, and that the lien was therefore a fraudulent encumbrance filed without legal basis. He said the word fraudulent without raising his voice. He let it sit. He then held up the additional violation notices, the road, the shed, the garden. He described each one briefly. He said that the total penalties now exceeded $10,000, all assessed against a property the association had no jurisdiction over. He said he had a lawyer. He said the lawyer had already documented everything. Then he did something he had not announced in advance. He invited Margaret Wilson to stand up. She stood. He said her name and described what had happened to her garden in 2 sentences. He invited Daniel Brooks to stand. Daniel stood in his wheelchair, and the room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Ethan described the ramp. He described the fine. He said the word disability and did not follow it with anything softer. He did not editorialize. He did not call Patricia names. He simply described what had happened to these people and let the room hold it. By the time he sat down, the meeting was no longer under Patricia's control. People were talking to each other. Several people near the front had turned in their seats to look at Margaret. A man near the door called out and asked the board how the lien had been approved in the first place. Another asked whether the board had legal authority to hire outside attorneys on the community's funds without a member vote. A woman in the middle section stood and said she had received 4 violation notices for her window treatments over the past 18 months, and that she wanted to know if those fines were also going to be reviewed. Patricia tried to regain the floor. She managed a few sentences before she was interrupted again. The attorney the HOA had retained leaned over and said something to her. Patricia's face did something that Ethan, watching from the back, could not fully read. It was part anger, part something that might have been the first recognition that the ground had shifted. The meeting ended without a resolution. But when Ethan walked out, Margaret caught up with him in the parking lot and touched his arm and said, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to do that." He thanked her and said she had done it too, just by standing up, and he meant it. The local news had been tipped off. Ethan suspected by one of the residents at the meeting, though he never confirmed it, and a reporter from the regional television station called Robert's office the following morning. Robert discussed the situation with Ethan, and they agreed to speak on the record. The reporter was thorough. She spent 2 days reviewing the documents, interviewing Margaret and Daniel and 2 other residents who were willing to be named, and consulting with a property law professor at Vanderbilt who described the water rights situation as extraordinary and the lien as textbook slander of title. The broadcast ran on a Thursday evening. The title of the segment was something along the lines of HOA accused of overreach and now faces a reckoning over community water supply. Ethan watched it on the television in his cabin. He thought the framing was a little theatrical, but the facts were accurate, and the professor's explanation of the legal issues was clear and measured. Patricia appeared in a brief clip recorded outside the community center in which she described the water rights claim as a form of blackmail and said the board would fight it. She looked smaller on camera than she had seemed in person. What Patricia did next demonstrated either extraordinary confidence or a complete failure to assess the situation accurately. She filed an emergency motion in county court seeking a temporary restraining order against Ethan, claiming that his notice regarding the water rights constituted an imminent threat to community welfare, and requesting that the court prohibit him from taking any action to restrict water access while the matter was litigated. The filing was made on a Friday afternoon. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Ethan and Robert appeared in court on Tuesday morning. The judge reviewed the filings. The HOA's attorney argued that irreparable harm to the community justified emergency relief. Robert argued that an emergency injunction requires a showing of likely success on the merits, and that the association had no viable claim against a prior appropriation right that had been legally registered and uncontested for over 2 decades. He also noted for the record that the party seeking emergency relief was the same party that had initiated the dispute by filing a fraudulent lien against a non-member property. He said this without apparent satisfaction, the way a person states a geometrically obvious truth. The judge denied the motion from the bench. She said that the association had not demonstrated a legal basis for restraining the exercise of a validly held property right, and that the appropriate resolution was negotiation or litigation on the merits, not an emergency injunction. She added that the court expected the parties to conduct themselves in good faith going forward. Patricia, sitting in the gallery, did not react visibly, but her attorney gathered his papers in a way that communicated something. After the hearing in the hallway outside the courtroom, Robert told Ethan they have no moves left. The court isn't going to help them. The press isn't on their side. The community is fracturing. The only path they have now is to negotiate, and they know it. Ethan nodded. He said he knew what he wanted to offer. He said he didn't want to hurt those families. He had never wanted that. Robert told him the conditions needed to be clear and enforceable, and he needed to be prepared to follow through if they weren't met. Ethan said he was prepared. He had been an engineer for 30 years. He knew how to build things that held. The 30th day of the notice period fell on a Friday in November. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of cold that settles into the hills and doesn't lift until noon. Ethan drove out to the northeastern edge of his property, where the old concrete valve house sat at the outlet of Silver Lake, a structure that had been there since before he bought the land built by whoever had first diverted the lake water for agricultural use. The valve inside was original, a large hand-wheel gate valve, the kind of infrastructure that engineers of an earlier era built to last. It still worked. He had tested it the previous week. It operated smoothly. A small group had gathered on the gravel path outside the valve house. Robert was there with 2 of his paralegals. Margaret Wilson had come, and Daniel Brooks and several other residents. A news camera crew stood at a respectful distance. The HOA board had sent 4 members, including 2 who had been on the board for less than a year, and who wore expressions that clearly communicated they wished they were somewhere else. Patricia Coleman was there as well, standing apart from the other board members, her face carrying an expression that was difficult to name. It was not quite defiance and not quite fear, but something that occupied the contested territory between them. Ethan stood near the valve house. He had a single sheet of paper which he read from without preamble. He said that what he was about to propose was not a threat and not a punishment. He said he understood that the residents of Silver Creek Estates were not responsible for the decisions their board had made, and that he had no interest in causing harm to families who had done nothing wrong. He said he had thought carefully about what a fair resolution looked like, and that he believed the following conditions were fair. The lien against his property was to be released, and the release recorded with the county within 15 business days. All fines and penalties assessed against his property were to be formally voided and confirmed in writing. The association was to issue written apologies to each resident who had been subjected to improper fines or coercive enforcement, specifically naming Margaret Wilson and Daniel Brooks, as well as any other individuals who submitted documented complaints. The current board of directors was to submit its collective resignation, and a new election was to be held under independent oversight within 60 days. Patricia Coleman was permanently prohibited from serving in any governance capacity within the Silver Creek Estates HOA or any successor organization. In exchange for those conditions being met in full, Ethan Walker would not exercise his right to restrict the water supply. He would instead enter into a formal water use agreement granting the Silver Creek Estates community access to Silver Lake under a recorded easement in perpetuity for the nominal consideration of $1 per year. The agreement would be drafted by Robert's firm and recorded with the county. It would be binding. It would ensure that the community never had to worry about the water supply again. He put the paper down. He said, "Those are my conditions. I'll give you until the end of the business day to consult with your board and your attorney. If the conditions are accepted, we execute the agreement next week. If they are not accepted, I'll proceed according to my rights under the prior appropriation." Then he stood quietly and waited. The HOA's attorney pulled the board members into a huddle near the tree line. They talked for a long time. Patricia said something at one point, and the attorney said something back to her, and whatever he said caused her to go quiet. The two newer board members kept looking at each other, and then at the valve house, and then back at each other. At 11:47 in the morning, the board chair, a man named Stephen Merritt, who had been elected the previous spring and had by all accounts been trying since his election to moderate Patricia's more extreme tendencies without success, came back to where Ethan was standing. He said, "We accept the conditions, all of them." Patricia turned and walked away through the frost-stiffened grass without saying anything to anyone. The camera crew tracked her for a moment and then stopped. Margaret Wilson, standing nearby, exhaled. It was a small sound, but Ethan heard it. The formal agreement was executed 9 days later in the conference room of Robert's Nashville office, signed by Stephen Merritt on behalf of the Transitional Board and by Ethan Walker on behalf of himself. The water use easement was recorded with the county the following afternoon. The lien was released within the 15-day window, the release filed with the county recorder's office, and confirmed in writing to Robert's firm. The individual apologies were written and delivered, though their sincerity varied. Margaret said that the letter she received was better than nothing, and that she had framed it not as a cherished document, but as a record of the fact that she had been right all along. Daniel Brooks received his apology by hand delivery, and the pending fine notice that had been clouding his title for nearly 2 years was formally voided. The documentation of that voiding was what he asked for specifically, and he received it. The board elections were held in December under the oversight of a retired judge who had been recommended by Robert and accepted by both parties. 6 new board members were elected. Stephen Merritt ran and won, with Margaret Wilson running alongside him. She won by the largest margin of any candidate. Daniel Brooks was asked to serve on the newly formed Equity Review Committee, which was charged with examining every fine and enforcement action taken over the previous 6 years and making recommendations about remediation. He accepted. The Equity Review Committee spent 5 months going through the records. What they found was that the pattern of enforcement under Patricia's tenure was not random. It was concentrated. Certain types of residents had received a disproportionate share of the notices. Elderly homeowners who were unlikely to engage legal counsel, residents whose first language was not English, individuals with visible medical accommodations, and anyone who had previously challenged the board's authority in any formal or informal way. The committee documented 47 cases of enforcement that they considered either legally improper or demonstrably retaliatory. 31 of those cases resulted in financial restitution from the HOA's reserve fund amounts, ranging from a few $100s to, in one case, several thousand for a resident who had paid fines under duress over the course of 4 years without ever understanding the process for challenging them. The new board's first act of governance, separate from the equity review, was to revise the community standards document. The revision took 4 months of public comment periods and working sessions that any resident could attend. The new standards were shorter, clearer, and included a formal process for appealing violations with binding arbitration available if the appeal was denied. The approved color palette for exterior improvements was expanded significantly. Window boxes were no longer mentioned. Reasonable accommodations for medical needs were explicitly protected with language that made the applicable legal framework explicit, rather than leaving it to interpretation. The document was written in plain English on purpose at the insistence of Margaret Wilson, who said at a working session that a community standards document that required a law degree to understand was a document designed to create uncertainty rather than resolve it. No one disagreed with her. Ethan kept his property exactly as it had been. The equipment shed remained the same shade of dark green he had always liked. The horses grazed in the lower pasture. The vegetable garden came back in spring more abundant than the previous year because he had taken the winter to amend the soil. He did not attend any HOA meetings because he was still not a member of the HOA, and he had no intention of becoming one. But occasionally, a resident from Silver Creek Estates would find their way down the gravel road to his property sometimes to thank him, sometimes just to see the place, the lake visible through the birch trees in the low morning light. One afternoon in late April, Ethan was fishing from the small dock he kept at the southern edge of Silver Lake when he heard tires on gravel and looked up to see Stephen Merritt's truck pulling in. Stephen climbed out and walked down to the dock and asked if he could join. Ethan said he could and pointed to the tackle box. Stephen found a rod and rigged it without asking for help, which Ethan appreciated. They fished for an hour without talking very much, which was about the right amount. At some point, Stephen said, "I want you to know that I'm sorry it got to where it did. I should have pushed back harder earlier." Ethan thought about that for a moment, and then said that in his experience, people didn't usually push back until they had a reason to believe they could win. Stephen said that was probably true. They went back to fishing. The water was still. The light through the birches came in at a low angle and lay flat on the surface the way light does in late spring when the sun hasn't yet climbed to its summer height. A heron stood on a log across the lake still as something cast in iron, waiting with the patient certainty of a creature that has never had to think about property rights or HOA covenants or prior appropriation claims. Ethan watched it for a while. He thought about what the past several months had required of him, not courage exactly, because he had never felt afraid, more like patience, the discipline of not reacting when someone wants you to react. The refusal to match someone else's register of anger and contempt because the moment you do, you become part of the chaos they're generating rather than the alternative to it. He thought about Patricia standing at the edge of the frost-stiffened field, walking away through the grass, and he did not feel what he had expected to feel in that moment. He had expected something like satisfaction. What he felt instead was more like relief, the particular relief of a pressure that has been held for a long time, finally releasing not with a dramatic sound, but with a quietness that settles into the body slowly and takes a while to recognize. Patricia Coleman had spent years operating in a system she had built to function on fear. The moment someone appeared who was not afraid and was not going to pay the system had nothing left to offer. All of its momentum depended on compliance. Without it, there was only the paperwork and the legal exposure and the fact that she had been wrong and had known she was wrong and had pushed forward anyway. He did not feel sorry for her, but he also did not feel triumph. He felt something quieter than either of those things, a kind of settled recognition that the outcome had been, in the end, what it was always going to be if anyone was willing to stand still long enough and let the facts speak. The facts had been there all along. The deed, the water registration, the county records, the engineering report that showed a development built on an assumption that was never formalized. All of it had been sitting in file cabinets and county archives, waiting for someone to pull it out and read it. He had read it. He cast his line again. The surface of the lake went still. Across the water, the heron lifted without warning and was gone before either of them could track where it went. The legal resolution of the Silver Creek Estates case was in a narrow technical sense unspectacular. No criminal charges were ever filed. Patricia Coleman did not go to prison. She relocated to another county within a year of the board's dissolution, and as far as anyone knew, rebuilt a quieter life, away from positions of community authority. There were no reports of her taking on a similar role elsewhere, though Robert said he had heard through the particular informal network that real estate attorneys maintain that she had tried and been rejected for a volunteer governance position in her new community after someone looked her up in public records. Whether that was true, Ethan neither confirmed nor cared. The HOA continued to operate with new leadership and revised governance structures. Most of the residents simply went on with their lives, mowing lawns, parking cars, maintaining properties, the ordinary business of living in a planned community, now conducted under rules that were recognizably fair. But for Margaret Wilson, who replanted her cutting garden the following spring and sat beside it on summer mornings with her coffee, the outcome meant something more personal than a legal resolution. She sent Ethan a photograph that June the roses had come back fuller than before, the lavender standing in thick purple rows along the walk. She had added dahlias in 3 new varieties because she wrote in the note attached to the photograph she had decided that the fines had constituted a debt owed to her garden as much as to herself. For Daniel Brooks, who drove up his ramp every day without a pending fine notice waiting in his mailbox, it meant a restoration of something that had been taken from him, not by malice, but by the indifference of people in authority who had decided that their preferences outweighed his rights. He served on the Equity Review Committee with a thoroughness that the other members said made every meeting run long, but always ended in a better outcome. For the young family whose children played in the backyard without anxiety, without a parent scanning the yard to make sure the tricycle wasn't positioned in a way that might prompt another citation, it meant something that is hard to measure in legal terms, but very easy to feel. Ethan Walker never described what he had done as heroic. When people asked him about it, he tended to give a brief factual account, the lien, the deed, the water rights, the negotiation, and leave out the moral framing. He was not modest about it so much as uninterested in the narrative that people wanted to put around it. He had held a property right. He had used it appropriately in defense of something legitimate and in service of conditions that were, he believed, genuinely fair. He had not invented anything. He had not manipulated anything. He had simply read the documents that existed and understood what they meant. And then he had been willing to act on what he understood, which turned out to be the rarest part of the whole sequence. Power in his experience was not the capacity to force an outcome. Power was what happened when the paperwork was accurate and the facts were on your side and you were willing to be patient until the process ran its course. Patricia had wielded authority for years, real authority backed by legal structures and financial penalties and the social pressure of a closed community, and she had used it as a weapon rather than a tool. That was ultimately the error. Not the lien specifically, not the paint violation or the garden removal or the ramp fine, as egregious as each of those things was. The error was the conviction that authority was the same thing as being right, that the power to enforce a rule was the same as the legitimacy of the rule, that the people subject to that authority had no recourse, no leverage, nothing to bring to bear against her. Every system built on that conviction has a hidden fragility, and that fragility is this. The moment someone appears who is not afraid and will not pay, and knows exactly what the documents say, the whole structure becomes visible for what it always was, not law, not justice, but performance. And performance, unlike law, collapses the moment the audience stops participating. She had been wrong about all of it. And she had been wrong in particular about the quiet man with the 25 acres and the dark green shed and the deed with the water rights language she had never thought to check. He reeled in his line and set the rod down and looked at the lake for a long time. The surface held the late afternoon light without moving. Silver Lake had been here long before any of them, before the development, before the deed, before the valley was parceled and surveyed and assigned to individuals who thought they owned pieces of it. It would be here after all of them. It did not take sides. But it had, for one particular season, offered Ethan Walker exactly what he needed to make things right. He thought that was enough. He thought that was, in fact, more than enough. Some things are resolved in courtrooms and conference rooms and county recorders' offices, and some things are resolved beside still water on a cool afternoon in April. Two men with fishing rods, and nothing much left to say about the months that had just passed, because the months had passed, and the outcome was what it was, and the lake was the same lake it had always been, patient and indifferent and older than any of the claims anyone had ever made upon it. He picked up his rod, found his bait, and cast again into the still water and waited.